Janet Dolgin is actually the Jack and Freda Dicker Distinguished Professor of Healthcare Law at Hofstra. She is a very distinguished scholar in health law, in family law, in bioethics, written books and articles. Her background is anything but shabby. She's got her BA from Barnard, an MA and a PhD from Princeton. She then taught at Columbia anthropology for several years, then decided she would give law a shot and went to Yale Law School. Subsequent to that, worked in a New York City firm for a few years, and then began teaching at Hofstra. I had the pleasure of first getting to meet her. She was a visiting professor at Cornell when I was there, and I've had the very good fortune that we've stayed in touch over the years, and her work is really absolutely one of the most creative and interesting scholars I've encountered in any area, and I'm very pleased to present her today to give this lecture.
I thank the Dean for his words and also for being the Dean. It's really wonderful to be here with Dean Simpson and so many other wonderful people. I'm going to describe a project. It was conducted by me and Catherine Fisher, who is a member of Hofstra's Faculty Computer Services Department, and Terry Shapiro, who is a statistician. And it just occurred to me, so I have to stand here, right? Because you're, I'm sorry. I don't like stand. All right, you got it. Terry Shapiro, who's a psychologist at Hofstra, and the early stages of the project owe a debt to Steve Levick, who helped design our survey instrument. My presentation will focus on three related matters: a set of consequences, both social and political, of human embryonic stem cell research, a survey designed to elucidate those consequences, and some general conclusions and insights derived from the survey. Human embryonic stem cells were isolated in 1998, really by two researchers, James Thompson at Wisconsin, and then John Gearhart at Johns Hopkins actually isolated human embryonic germ cells. Probably most people know this, but I want to say this early on and not forget to say it because it's essential, at least in some part, to a lot of the controversy about human embryonic stem cells. The derivation of embryonic stem cells, they're typically derived from the 5-day embryo. The derivation destroys the embryo. So if people don't know that, it's hard to understand in some part why there's so much controversy about the matter. And in very significant part, that is why the debate about human embryonic stem cells was almost immediately conflated with the debate about abortion. For a set of reasons that I don't really have time to talk about in the body of this talk, the debate about abortion shifted in the years after Roe versus Wade from a focus on family relationships to a focus on the ontological status of the fetus and the embryo. And thus, for pro-life adherents in particular, the links between abortion and human embryonic stem cell research were too compelling to ignore. The parameters of the debate about human embryonic stem cell research are actually reflected in President Bush's 2001 statement about federal funding for the research. Bush allowed federal funding for stem cell lines created as of the day of his statement, August 9, 2001, and precluded federal funding for research on any stem cell lines created after that day. He'd been in office less than a year. He was elected as a staunch pro-life candidate. But his statement is very interesting because it balances two things. In his 2001 statement, he said, "I believe that human life is a sacred gift from our Creator. I worry about a culture that devalues life." But he then balanced that conviction against the promise of research. What he referred to as, again I quote him, "the hope that millions of our loved ones may be cured of a disease and rid of their suffering." His 2001 compromise satisfied almost no one, but it does, I think, reflect the ways in which the debate has developed. In Congress, surprising lines of debate appeared. A number of pro-life senators and congressional representatives distinguished the embryo at stake in human embryonic stem cell research from the embryo at stake in the debate about abortion. I'm going to give you one example. There are actually many. I'm going to give you an example from something said by former Senator Connie Mack, a Republican from Florida. Senator Mack was talking about the use of cloned embryos for the derivation of embryonic stem cells. But it's important to understand that these embryos, they didn't exist at the time. They only recently have cloned human embryos been created to this point in development. They didn't exist at that time. There was a promise that they might one day. But in theory, at least, they are fully capable of reproduction. So it's important to understand that in thinking about Mack's statement. Senator Mack said, "Look, you're using an egg that has never been fertilized by sperm and is never placed in a uterus." And this is the part I think is really interesting. The words that we're using were defined in a former age. Yet by 2006, a majority in both the Senate and the House had decided to favor federal funding for human embryonic stem cell research. A bill was passed in both houses. Bush vetoed it. It was actually the first veto of Bush's presidency. But that's interesting. I'm thinking of embryos, presidency. So the veto was overridden. In 2007, a similar bill was passed. Again, Bush vetoed it. Again, the veto was not overridden. So now the federal government will not fund human embryonic stem cell research. Public debate has been as intense and as complicated as debate among politicians. 5 years after human embryonic stem cells were isolated in 2003, Irving Weissman, a developmental psychologist at Stanford, decided to investigate public attitudes toward the research in a sort of informal social experiment. Weissman asked people chosen at random to draw an embryo. Invariably, and I quote him, he said they drew a fetus with a face. Weissman suggested, and this is what an embryo looks like at the point at which stem cells are derived. This is a picture, an actual photograph of a 5-day embryo. Weissman suggested that at least some of the public opposition to human embryonic stem cell research reflected an inaccurate understanding of what the embryo at this stage of development looks like. We designed the study I'm going to describe to test Weissman's reports from his informal experiment and, more generally, to investigate social attitudes toward human embryonic stem cell research. In the fall 2007, we collected data from 279 respondents, and in early 2008, just a couple of months ago, we interviewed 9 of the respondents. About 3/4 of the respondents who completed the survey online, about a quarter completed it in hard copy. Almost 2/3 of our respondents live in the United States South, from Florida in the east to Texas in the West. And we purposely selected respondents from that part of the country because they assumed that they would be more likely than respondents representative of the country as a whole to oppose human embryonic stem cell research. We were interested in particular about knowing about people who oppose the research. I'm referring to this group of respondents as Group 1 respondents. About 100 respondents reside throughout the United States. We hope they would provide a comparative base. I refer to them as Group 2 respondents. The last survey item offered respondents an opportunity to be interviewed in greater detail about the subject of the survey. We were able to interview 9 people. I mean, many more actually said on the survey that they would be willing to be interviewed, but when I emailed them, they either didn't respond or they responded with sort of a very interesting but non-responsive comments, or they said, I didn't really mean it, but we were only able to interview 9 respondents. One of our hopes is to redo this study using a much, much larger group of respondents, hopefully one large enough to reflect the country as a whole, and to interview many, many more people. Because we did find a far more nuanced response in the interviews, obviously. I do think that each methodology, the quantitative survey and the qualitative interviews, complemented the other. As a general matter, about half of our respondents reported approving, or supporting was the word we actually used in the survey, human embryonic stem cell research. About a quarter opposed it, and the last quarter reported either that they had no opinion or that they neither opposed nor supported it. Now, I just want to note there, you may think those are the same things, but actually one of our interviewees checked the box, neither oppose nor favor, and she explained that in a very interesting way. She said, I adore it and I abhor it. So she actually both favored and opposed it, and she said the closest response that the survey provided to my feeling was neither favor nor oppose. Interestingly, a survey carried out by the Genetics and Public Policy Center in 2005 found that among a representative sample of the United States population, about 2/3 of the respondents approve of human embryonic stem cell research. In the center's study, about a quarter disapproved, a little more than a quarter, and the remaining group had no opinion on the matter. That our numbers differ from theirs. In particular, a half of our respondents approved of the research, 2/3 of theirs did, may be the result of our comparatively small sample. It may be a result of our having selected respondents more likely to oppose than to approve of the research. And it may, and this is a very interesting possibility, reflect a shift in public attitudes between their study reported in 2005 and ours, which was just completed. The first item of our survey asked respondents to draw a human embryo as you imagine it looks at 5 days of development. And I'm going to show you 5 prototypic drawings. We assessed these drawings on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 having virtually no human or fetal features, 1 having virtually no human or fetal features, and 5 having many features, either of the late-term fetus or the neonate. Now, you see here, the first 2 drawings we assessed as Category 1. Category 1 drawings, and we weren't in particular interested in whether people had a sophisticated biological background, but we rated as 1s drawings that were either single circles or 2 circles or a set of circles. Nobody actually drew what would have been an extraordinarily sophisticated cross-section of the 5-day blastocyst showing a hollow core, but we did get lots of drawings like this. About half of our drawings were either like the first or the second drawing there. The third drawing here we rated as a 2. Drawings in category 2 began to take the shape, typically a crescent shape, of an early fetus, but contained no features beyond a shape beyond simple circles. About 30% of the respondents drew embryos that we assessed as 2s. So as you see, progressively each drawing looks more and more like not necessarily a fetus, but I think like a person. And the last one is really quite interesting. I interviewed that woman. The subject was of enormous moment to her for a variety of very interesting reasons. And she really saw the embryo as looking, as you see, like a neonate. I mean, that is or is practically the picture of a full-term baby. We're not here, of course, assuming that anybody had any art talent, but I think that's a really interesting picture. Our expectation that people who drew embryos with fetal or neonatal characteristics would more likely oppose embryonic stem cell research is not reflected in the data. In fact, we found no significant relationship between drawings and attitudes toward embryonic stem cell research. And similarly, despite expectations, the drawings of people in group 1 were no more likely than the drawings of people in group 2 to show fetal and or neonatal features. About 60%, a bit more, about 60% of the full respondent group described the early embryo with fair accuracy. Very few, 7%, described the early embryo as being 4 inches or larger in size. Actually, okay, there are no dots there, but an early embryo is smaller than a period. I was looking for a period there, but an early embryo is really, really small. Most people knew that. In addition, a majority of the respondents, and this is really interesting, including some who oppose embryonic stem cell research, did not view the early embryo as a person or a potential person. Other options included things like a bunch of cells, a clump of cells. We had a lot of debate about what the option should be, a human organ. Most people said that an early embryo was one of those things, and some of those people opposed human embryonic stem cell research. So most of the people had a much more accurate understanding of the early embryo than we assumed they would have, interestingly enough. And I just say this because it sort of interested me. It's not of the essence. There was no correlation between the drawings and whether or not respondents had had a post-high school biology course. When I talk about this at my own university, I say, we clearly are not part of what's implied in the next sentence, and I now say case isn't either, but it does make me wonder about post-high school biology courses. The absence of a relationship between respondents' drawings and their attitudes may be the result of the widespread media attention that's been given to embryonic stem cell research in the last decade, but in particular in the last 5 years. The cover of Time magazine 2 or 3 years ago actually sported something sort of like this, a picture of a blastocyst. Even as recently as 5 years ago, when drawings done for Irv Weissman featured fetal or neonatal characteristics, many fewer people had been exposed to depictions of the embryo. Our data suggests that people are less likely to revise their attitudes toward embryonic stem cell research than their understanding of the early embryo. And those who oppose human embryonic stem cell research on religious grounds may be more reluctant than others, even as they change their understanding of the early embryo, to discard deeply held views, especially since our data show that people's attitudes toward embryonic stem cell research reflect their understanding of their religion's attitudes. Catholic and Protestant respondents, and this was actually the strongest relationship we found in the data, a correlation between attitudes and religion. Catholic and Protestant respondents were much more likely than others, including Jews, Muslims, and people reporting themselves religiously unaffiliated, to oppose human embryonic stem cell research, and Protestants affiliated with evangelical or fundamentalist groups were much more likely than any others, including Catholics, to oppose the research. Interestingly, the study done by the Genetics and Public Policy Center showed that members of evangelical and fundamentalist religious groups are 10 times more likely than anyone else in the population to oppose human embryonic stem cell research. I think that this strong relationship between attitudes toward embryonic stem cell research and religious affiliation demands further study. It may be that people look to religious leaders in forming their attitudes toward embryonic stem cell research. It may be that members of religious groups share a set of beliefs and values that inform their attitude toward embryonic stem cell research. And it may be, and I found a little evidence of this in the interviews, that in choosing to affiliate with, or even more important perhaps in choosing to stay affiliated with a particular religious group, people are influenced by the group's attitude toward a set of important social issues, including human embryonic stem cell research. As I said, the data gathered through the interviews provides a much more nuanced view than the survey data that I have so far referred to. A detailed review of the interviews will appear in our published report, but I will give you a couple of patterns that emerged in the interview. So I kind of apologize for this one. Obviously, there's too much data there, but I can print it out and give out hard copies to anybody interested. It's just a summary of the population who responded to our survey. But what I want to show you now, just to give you a fuller sense of what the embryo drawings look like, and I'll show these as I continue to talk, the drawings done by the people we interviewed, the 9 drawings of embryos done by the 9 people whom we interviewed. As many of the interviewees reported favoring as reported opposing human embryonic stem cell research. Actually, 8 favored, 8 opposed, and 1, as I already told you, reported that she neither favored nor opposed, but actually strongly favored and strongly opposed. I mean, she had reasons to think that it was horrible and wonderful. For each interviewee, human embryonic stem cell research raised deeply personal issues. Each interviewee embedded his or her responses in an encompassing personal narrative. They didn't just answer the questions. They said, this is important to me because my child, my mother, my sister, my cousin, myself, my history. Every single response was part of the interviewee's sense of his or her own life and personal history. For each interviewee, regardless of attitude toward embryonic stem cell research, the subject had implications for a wide array of important social issues, including abortion, gender, religion, and national politics, and family relationships. We'd expected such implications for interviewees who opposed embryonic stem cell research. But to our surprise, they were prominent as well among the interviewees who favored it, who reported, much as did those who oppose it, that the subject is deeply meaningful. Obviously, the interviews were conducted with a self-selected group of interviewees, but I think the intensity of the interviewees' responses was really quite amazing. Now, I'll begin to show you the pictures done by the interviewees, really just to, and you can see how we assessed those. Read together, the quantitative and qualitative data prompt a number of questions and suggest a number of conclusions. Our expectation that the attitude of respondents toward embryonic stem cell research would reflect their understanding of the early embryo is not, as I say, reflected in the data. Most survey respondents had a fairly accurate understanding of the early embryo. And I do think that's probably because of the, I mean, I suppose if you, I don't have a TV, but my guess is if you watch TV, you certainly can't avoid seeing an embryo today. A number of interviewees hinted that their deep opposition to human embryonic stem cell research could shift or be mitigated were its medical promise more fully to emerge. This is very interesting because it suggests that people may more widely disassociate the debate about abortion from the debate about human embryonic stem cell research. Or it suggests, and this is presumably discomforting to pro-life adherents, it suggests that shifts in attitude toward embryos in the context of human embryo stem cell research may facilitate shifts in attitude toward embryos in the context of abortion. These suggestions must be assessed, however, in light of the strong relationship between people's attitudes toward embryonic stem cell research and their religious affiliations, and that's one of the things we want to focus on in the larger study. But also we have to consider the assumptions that underlie the intensity of responses toward embryonic stem cell research among people who favor it. In fact, the great majority of respondents reporting no religious affiliation favor the research. I mean, well over 90% of people who said they had no religious affiliation favor the research, as did the great majority of Jews and a significant majority of Muslims. But our numbers were so small with regard to the Muslims that I just say it. I draw no conclusions. I think the intensity of response among these groups, people who favor the research, suggests three possible explanations. A general commitment in the United States to science and progress, a notion that health is tantamount to salvation, and that phrase is not my own. It comes from the French theorist Foucault, or perhaps opposition at various levels of consciousness to religious fervor and to a set of political positions, including attitudes toward embryonic stem cell research associated with those who oppose human embryonic stem cell research. Our interviews suggest each of the possibilities may be real. For the people we interviewed, human embryonic stem cell research and questions about it constituted a sort of social Rorschach test. Those interviews connected their responses to positions about a far-ranging set of crucial social issues, as I say, family, parentage, abortion, suffering, illness, religion, and personhood. The intensity and complexity of responses among our respondents reflects the intensity and complexity of responses among political figures. The debate, I think, demands careful observation. It reveals, as does the debate about abortion, it's for this reason that, to me at least, it's so important. It reveals a society contemplating itself. It's a very rare thing to find. You know, what does the society think of itself? You can find something out about that by studying responses to human embryonic stem cell research. It reveals a society contemplating itself, its most deeply held beliefs and values, its view of personhood, and its vision of the future. So I really hope that we'll get to do the larger study, and I can, in one form or another, tell you more about what people think in a couple of years. I'd be delighted to entertain questions if that's in order. Oh, so there you go. You can see the rest of the pictures. Where are the cells coming from? I'm talking about embryonic stem cells. Stem cells can come from Lots of places. There is a basic distinction between so-called adult and so-called embryonic stem cell research, although, interestingly, cells taken from fetuses are referred to as adult stem cells. The cells come from the mass of cells near the core of the blastocyst, and they destroy it. The blastocyst does not survive. It cannot be used for reproductive purposes after these cells are taken. Oh, so that's a very interesting question. Where are human embryos going to come from? The two bills that Congress passed, both in 06 and 07, that which vetoed, provided for the use of what are called excess embryos, cryopreserved as a result of in vitro fertilization. So these are embryos that come from people who agreed to allow excess embryos, which means embryos they don't want to use for reproductive purposes, to be used in research. And the theory behind the use of those embryos to smooth some of the edges of the debate was that these embryos aren't going to be used anyway, so they might as well be used with the possibility of saving lives and curing diseases. It's possible, however, to clone a human embryo, and now that was just done. I mean, the report was, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks ago. You could clone embryos and use stem cells from those embryos, but understand that embryo is also capable of reproduction. I mean, that's a very complicated matter, and virtually nobody, I mean, you say that and then 10 people say, but not me. Virtually nobody at this moment at least approves of reproductive cloning. But understand that a cloned embryo is an embryo. Now, there are lots of other possibilities that are emerging. Just, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago, a group of scientists, one in Japan and actually Jamie Thompson's group at Wisconsin, reported reprogramming somatic cells. I mean, this is really mind-boggling. Reprogramming, they actually use skin cells. They reprogram skin cells, and they argue that they can extract stem cells. They're not embryonic stem cells, but they argue that they actually inserted a set of viral vectors. It's a very complicated matter because at this moment, the genes that they inserted and that turned these somatic cells into embryonic-like stem cells are cancer-causing. So there's question about the use of reprogrammed cells for the therapy and cure. And adult cells come from a wide variety of somatic tissue, I mean, skin cells and a variety of, bone marrow transplants are actually a form of stem cell therapy. Bone marrow transplants are stem cells coming from the bone marrow. So it's a very good and very complicated question.
The reprogramming that you just mentioned, I think is motivated by the hope that that would circumvent the concern about embryonic stem cells. But I think it illustrates, how we feel about things versus our understanding of science. Because you could very well say that if an adult stem cell or an adult skin cell, fibroblast, something is reprogrammed, it now has the capacity to become a human being.
You got it. So that's at this...
We're back where we started.
At this point, nobody has managed to bring them back that far, but clearly that's right there. And nobody much talks about it. Very, very interesting. I mean, the possibility of reprogramming somatic cells into gametic cells is off the edge, but clearly that's what's going to happen. And then the debate picks up exactly where it is at this moment. There is actually another technique that Bill Hurlbut, who's a member of the President's Council and a scientist at Stanford, has tried, but so far without success, to affect so-called altered nuclear transfer. He wants to basically use the technique that allows for somatic cell nuclear transfer cloning. He wants to use it, but in such a way that the resulting embryo is not capable of reproduction. That so far hasn't happened. So,
where is this being done without controversy?
Oh, okay, yeah. So, I mean, you know, it's legal in the United States to do embryonic stem cell research. It's just that the federal government won't pay for it. So it can be done anywhere as long as you use non-federal money. Maybe not in Louisiana, actually, because well, seriously, because an embryo is a juridical person in Louisiana. Now, see, here's the complicated thing. Yeah, right. So I'm censoring my response to that, which I won't censor. They might do a better job than most of us. It's funded at private medical schools. I mean, the pharmaceuticals are doing it for a very interesting reason. The pharmaceuticals, I mean, why is it useful? There's a ton of hype in the media about, oh, we're going to cure cancer, we're going to cure Alzheimer's, we're going to cure Parkinson's, we're going to cure amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Maybe. You know, maybe. All of these diseases that are basically the result in a problem with one protein are candidates for embryonic stem cell cure or stem cell cure. However, the real use in research by the pharmaceuticals is to test drugs. I mean, imagine that you don't have to hit clinical populations with drugs. You can put stem cells in a dish and see what the drugs do to them. The pharmaceuticals, I mean, Pfizer's doing it, Merck's doing it, all the big, and of course, and this raises a set of really tough legal issues. About 6 or 7 states have recently, I mean, since Bush's statement in 2001, have committed, in some cases, very significant money to embryonic stem cell research. California has committed, I think, $3 billion over 10 years as a result of a voter initiative. So California not only has, you know, Stanford and so on supporting it, but the state is supporting it. And so in a number of other states, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Maryland is on the edge, New York is on the edge. But here's the complicated thing from a legal point of view. You see, if you're doing, lots of science is federally funded, lots. Science would really collapse without federal funding, without in particular NIH funding. If you're doing embryonic stem cell research and it's being funded by states or by institutional money, you have to have a separate lab because the federal government won't let you use a pipette that's being used for embryonic stem cell research in federally funded research. Now, that's just the beginning. You also end up with a slew of legal rules. So I was recently talking to somebody from one of the big pharmaceuticals. That company wants to join with some scientists at Harvard and Stanford to do embryonic stem cell research. They have to follow California law, Massachusetts law, federal law, and so it's a lawyer's nightmare. Now, you know, it's a very complicated matter. Pushing it all over into the federal domain has got its complications also. Sharona, sorry.
I was struck by how few people agreed to be interviewed, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on why that might be and how you might cure that in a future study, because you don't want to get 18 next time.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, it's hard for me to know because I couldn't ask the people who did agree why others didn't. So I have only a couple of guesses. We did the survey, and the online survey I found really cool. We actually used a program that allowed people to draw an embryo online. And then we got back to us a set of numbers that had to be plugged into the program, and when they were, we got these pictures, which I hope the pictures are even true, right? This is a certain leap of faith here, but my notion is these are the embryos they drew. The original survey was distributed through a survey company, Luth Research in California. They have big panels of people throughout the country that they send surveys out to. They did this for us. I mean, it costs a lot of money, but it costs a little bit less, they argued at least, than most of their studies cost the people who make deals with them because they were very interested and we weren't a commercial enterprise. But Luth typically pays its respondent panels. And even for this study, they paid them, I think, $2. And 2 people wrote back to me and said, what will I get if I interview you? And I said, the delight of the conversation. So they said, one said, okay, you know, that sounds all right. I'll do it. I'm a good guy. And the other never answered. So I don't know why. You know, it's a tiny percent. And I don't know how it compares with other efforts to interview respondents who have answered anonymous surveys. Now, understand, you know, this is completely anonymous. I have no idea who these people are. Once they provide contact information, I know who they are. This is a pretty touchy subject. You know, what if one's neighbors who have a completely contrary view and who think you do too find out? You know, we actually sent this through the Hofstra IRB, although they defined it as exempt for a variety of reasons from IRB approval. But I agreed to never, ever reveal anybody's identity. But, you know, were I a respondent and somebody agreed to never reveal my identity, I'd say nice. You know, maybe, maybe not. So I don't know. Maybe that was why people didn't say, yeah, here I am, I'm Susie Jones.
I had actually 2 questions for you. You mentioned earlier that people's opinions could be changed based on medical relatedness. Did any of the people who actually said that they approved or went along with stem cell research, did it have anything to do with a family illness or friend or family illness, or was that question asked?
Almost everybody referred to family illnesses or personal illnesses. And one man actually said he had changed his view when he found out how helpful. He was a very unusual man. I mean, again, it's a pre-selected group. The people who said they wanted to be interviewed had something to say. But this man had 2 children with serious, one a congenital problem and one a genetic problem, and he himself suffered from a serious coronary disease. And he said, look, you know, I'm old and I don't much care, but my children, I cannot refuse to support this. So yes, I mean, that was, for people who might have been on the edge, that was the thing that put them on the favoring side.
The second question had to do with relating to vectors. And you mentioned earlier with the vector virus related to moving DNA into potential embryonic stem cells. Today, researchers from Britain actually announced that they came up with embryonic stem cells made from cow cells. They had moved DNA from a human cell.
Yeah.
Was there any question related to how people view those type of embryos?
Yeah, so I didn't ask about chimeras. I mean, that's a really interesting question. Chimeras are, you know, beings, I mean, creatures that have parts or cells from more than one species. Now that can be sort of horrifying. I mean, you know, when people talk about things like reproductive technology, they refer to something called the yuck factor. I don't know why it's wrong, but yuck! So when I originally told my students about inserting human DNA into a cow ova for the purpose of cloning embryos, they said, I mean, yuck so loudly that I'm not going to sort of make everybody deaf by repeating the volume. But there's, you know, obviously enormous bioethical concern about chimeras in general and in this context also. You know, there are chimeras that are not, I suppose, I never heard anybody being you know, in theory, a human who has a pig heart valve is a chimera. But so nobody's upset about that, but this is upsetting to a lot of people.
I think if we weren't chimeras, we couldn't digest, but that's another matter.
Right. Well, that's true. Okay, good.
So with regard to the respondents who weren't interviewed, did you, besides the demographic information in the drawings, did you get other information from them about, and whether they were opposed or in favor?
Oh, sure. I mean, our survey had 30 questions.
So let me ask you this. With regard to those who drew relatively accurate pictures of the embryos, but who said they were opposed, could you get a sense of why they were opposed? And if so, was it that they understood that these, or they felt that these organisms or whatever could have become, humans or living, whatever, or was it that they were afraid of a slippery slope, that if we start doing it on these things, we could then move to more?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question.
Were you able to tease that kind of attitude out?
You know, it's very hard. This survey really struck me with how hard it is to draw conclusions from survey data, because you don't know why the person checked this box instead of that one. So in some part, I have to read back into it from what the people that we did interview said. But, you know, those people who drew accurate embryos and still opposed the research on the whole, said that the embryo was not a person or a potential person. So our interviewees said it's not a potential person until it becomes one. So, you know, that's a bit, but their sense was, I'm going to describe this accurately, but I know my son was once an embryo. And it was always embedded in religious belief, that kind of claim.
Let me extend that a little bit. For people who oppose research on embryos, given that they're from in vitro fertilized eggs for IVF, because they oppose it because I think they're killing a human being, they have to wrestle then with what's going to happen to those eggs. You know, there are probably millions of them that are in a freezer somewhere, a limbo, a non-religious limbo. And I know that it's easy to say, well, someday they will be used, but they won't, the vast, vast majority. Did anyone in your interviews, or maybe this is subject of future interviews, address that?
Yeah, so I think a few did. It's very, very, do you know about the Christian Nightlight Adoption Agency? I mean, I'm sure some people do, because Bush actually, in his 2001 statement on federal funding, he was surrounded by a group of adorable babies created in the context of in vitro, and then brought to gestation through the services of this group. This is a Christian group that uses so-called excess embryos, I mean, the term is brilliant. It's a simple term, but it's brilliant. They put them up for adoption. Now, I mean, here's why it's brilliant. It exactly conflates it with the debate about abortion. You don't have to abort. There's a baby, and somebody will adopt it. So this group defines embryos as babies and finds couples who are presumably incapable of producing embryos on their own, who want to gestate and become the social and legal parents of these babies. So people say, well, maybe there are excess embryos, but other people should adopt them. That, you know, the debate is, it's so rich, right? Right. Well, I always said I would have had 1 million kids, right? I meant that, yeah.
What's happening in the rest of the world? Are we being left way behind?
Yeah, so I mean, that's what I mean. On the one hand, I do have the sense that we'll do this research or we won't, but it's going to happen. So it's not the end of embryonic stem cell research because the United States government won't fund it. It's certainly being done in many places. It was very, very hurt in South Korea, for example, where I don't know how many of you know, but maybe 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago? Yeah, there was an announcement that human embryos had been cloned, and it not only turned out to be a self-conscious hoax, but it turned out they were using eggs without the consent of the egg donors, and the egg donors were in large part young women in the researcher's lab. So that really set back all of this research in South Korea. It's being done in China. Interestingly, this was probably about 5 years ago, a whole bunch of U.S. researchers actually made plans to move to China in some permanent or temporary way, because it's not that they can't do the research here, but people are worried that it might be made illegal here. At the moment, you can't fund it, get federal funding, but what if Congress said, no, we won't allow it? So a number of really important researchers made plans to go to China. It's an ironic story because that happened just before the SARS epidemic, and almost all of them backed out. So it's being done in a number of countries. It's being done in California and in many, I mean, in every state probably except Louisiana. It's being done in many countries. You know, I've said this before, she who presumes to prophesize renders herself a fool, but my guess is that whoever the next president is, I mean, that is to say, even if it's McCain, my guess is that this research will be federally funded. Certainly, if it's one of the Democrats, it will be. So, on that score, here are some more. So, I mean, it sounds as if what you're trying to say is that for obvious reasons, as opposed to for leap of faith reasons, the embryos enjoy personhood? Is that right? It's okay. Oh, okay. Okay. And that suggests what about the research? Your point. What does it suggest about the debate?
For me, as I see situation, almost mathematical certainty must be some intelligence we don't have both with God and other namely. Make this small cell to develop the person or that person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting argument because you get around the notion that just believe it, you provide a frame for believing it. Yes, in science. I understand. I understand. They may be less far apart than one presumes.
2 + 2 are 4. I don't believe that.
Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, so, I mean, you're trying to encompass the debate in a scientific frame. Yeah.
Let me thank Janet for a wonderful lecture and present her. This is something for her to remember the lecture by, and you can open it.
Well,
it has your name on it.
You know what? This is wonderful, and somehow every time I look at it, I'm going to think of all of you. But I must tell you, I would without this. So I appreciate. Thank you, Gary.